Nervous system. A nervous system is the body's control center and communication network. It directs the functions of body organs and system. For nervous system is the body's information gatherer storage center and control system. Its overall function is to collect the information about the body's external state, to analyze this information, and to respond appropriately to satisfy certain needs, and the most of which is survival. For basic functions, we have sensation, response, and integration. For sensation, receiving information about the environment to gain input about what is happening outside the body, or sometimes within the body. Response. For response, the nervous system produces a response on the basis of the stimuli perceived by sensory structures. And for the integration, stimuli that are received by sensory structures are communicated to the nervous system where that information is processed. And we have here the anatomical division. For anatomical division, we have central nervous system or CNS and peripheral nervous system or PNS. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. For peripheral nervous system or PNS is everything else. For the next presentation, let's proceed to Ms. Nina Broquesa.
Topic for today is about the functional divisions. First is somatic nervous system or SNS. It's responsible for conscious perception and voluntary motor responses. Responsible for function that result in the moving skeletal muscle. And next is autonomic nervous system or ANS. It's responsible for involuntary control of the body, usually for the sake of the homeostasis or regulation of the internal environment. Responsible for the function that affect cardia or smooth muscle tissue or the cause gland to produce the secretion. And the last is enteric nervous system or ENS. It's a special division responsible for the controlling the smooth muscle and glandular tissue in your digestive system. Next slide, we have the part of the nervous system, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. For the central nervous system, we have the brain and the spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system, we have ganglion and nerve. Next slide. The function of the brain or CNS, perception and processing of sensory stimuli, execution of voluntary motor responses, regulation of homeostatic mechanisms. For the nerve is fever of sensory and the motor neurons. Digestive tract or ENS, the enteric nervous system located in the digestive tract is responsible for autonomous function and can operate independently of the brain and the spinal cord. Spinal cord or CNS. Initiation of reflex from the ventral horn and lateral horn. Gray matter. The next is pathway for the sensory and motor function between the peripheral and the brain. And the last is ganglia or PNS. Reception of the sensory stimuli by dorsal root and cranial ganglia. Relay of visceral motor responses by autonomic ganglia. Next slides. Somatic structure include the spinal nerve, both motor and sensory fiber, as well as the sensory ganglia or the posterior root ganglia and cranial nerve ganglia. And the second is autonomic structure are found in the nerves also, but include the sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia. And the last is enteric nervous system. Include the nervous system tissue within the organs of the digestive tract. The next slide is presenting by Leah Tambong.
Types in CNS and PNS, a glial cell is one of variety of cells that provide a framework of those that support the nervous system and their activity. The neuron is the more functionally important of the two in terms of the communicative function of nervous system via electric signals.
The adult brain is separated into four major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. I'm gonna discuss first about the cerebrum, the largest portion, and contains the cerebral cortex and subcortical nuclei. It is divided into two halves by the longitudinal fissure. Cerebral cortex, separated into the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for motor functions, from planning movements through executing commands to be sent to the spinal cord and periphery. The most anterior portion of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with aspects of personality through its influence on motor responses in decision making. The other lobes are responsible for sensory function, such as parietal lobe is where somato sensation is processed. Occipital lobe is where visual processing begins, although the other parts of the brain can contribute to visual function. Temporal lobe contains the cortical area for auditory processing but also has regions crucial for memory formation. Subcortical nuclei. Nuclei beneath the cerebral cortex are responsible for augmenting cortical functions. The basal nuclei receive input from cortical areas and compare it with the general state of the individual through the activities of dopamine releasing nucleus. The output influences the activity of part of the thalamus that can then increase or decrease cortical activity that often result in changes to motor commands. The basal forebrain is responsible for modulating cortical activity in attention and memory. The limbic system includes deep cerebral nuclei that are responsible for memory and emotion.
Thank you, Ms. Simon. The cerebrum is a large component of the CNS and nucleus, and the most obvious aspect of it is the polished surface called the cerebral cortex. So we can see here the lateral view, cerebral cortex, corpus callosum, and cerebrum. In anterior view is right hemisphere, longitudinal fissure, and left hemisphere. The cerebral cortex is divided into four lobes. Extensive folding increases the surface area available for cerebral function. You can see here the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. We can also see here the precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus, parieto-occipital sulcus, and lateral sulcus. Number 2, diencephalon. The diencephalon is composed primarily of the thalamus and hypothalamus, which together define the walls of the third ventricle. Thalamus is a relay between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system. Hypothalamus coordinates homeostatic functions through the autonomic and endocrine systems. So this is our endocrine system composed of hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and thalamus. Number 3, the brainstem is composed of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. It controls the head and neck region of the body through the cranial nerves. There are control centers in the brainstem that regulate the cardiovascular and respiratory system. The brainstem comprises the regions the midbrain, pons, and medulla. We can see here in our chart. Number 4, cerebellum is connected to the brainstem, primarily at the pons, where it receives a copy of the descending input from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. It can compare this with sensory feedback input through the medulla and send output through the midbrain that can correct motor commands for coordination. The cerebellum is situated in the posterior surface. Thank you. For our next topic about the spinal cord, we discuss of Ms. function.
Thank you, Ms. Makaya. Let us now have the spinal cord. The length of the spinal cord is divided into regions that correspond to the regions of the vertebral column. The name of a spinal cord region corresponds to the level at which spinal nerves pass through the intervertebral foramina. Immediately adjacent to the brainstem is the cervical region, followed by the thoracic, then the lumbar, and finally the sacral region. The spinal cord is not the full length of the vertebral column because the spinal cord does not grow significantly longer after the first or second year, but the skeleton continues to grow. The nerves that emerge from the spinal cord pass through the intervertebral foramina at the respective levels. As the vertebral column grows, these nerves grows with it and result in a long bundle of nerves that resembles a horse's tail and is named the cauda equina. The sacral spinal cord is at the level of the upper lumbar vertebral bones. The spinal nerves extend from their various levels to the proper level of the vertebral column. This is an illustration of the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. And as you observe, the arrangement of gray and white matter in the spinal cord is relatively simple. The interior of the cord is formed by gray matter, which is surrounded by white matter. In transverse sections, the gray matter is conventionally divided into dorsal, lateral, and ventral horns, while the white matter of the spinal cord is subdivided into dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns, each of which contains axon tracts related to specific function. Now to continue our report, let us have Miss Maria Antoinette Agaya. Take it away, ma'am.
Thank you, Miss Baby Jean. The next slide would be the spinal cord column. You can see the illustration of a spinal column. Spinal column has 6 parts. The first part is the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral disc absorbs the stress and shocks the body in cures during movement and prevents the vertebrae from grinding against one another. The second part would be the superior articular process. The function of articular process is to obviously to limit rotation, which can take in the lumbar segment of the vertebral column during any asymmetrical movement of the body. The next part would be the transverse process. It serves as a point of attachment for muscles that help move the vertebrae. Next one is the spinous process, a bony projection of the posterior of each vertebra. Next part is the vertebral body. Vertebral body is the thick oval segment of bone forming the front of the vertebrae, also called the centrum. The last one would be the transverse costal effect, the surface that articulates with the same number for the first 10 thoracics. The next slide would be the spinal column. You can see the spinal column illustration here. Spinal column has 8 types of nerves. The first one is the cervical spine. The cervical spine has 8 pairs of spinal nerves. They are labeled as C1 to C8. They stimulate muscles in the head, neck, diaphragm, deltoids, biceps, wrist extenders, triceps, and hand. The next type is the thoracic nerves. The thoracic nerves has 12 nerve roots. They are labeled as T1 to T12. On each side of the spine that branch from the spinal cord and control motor and sensory signals, mostly for upper back, chest, and abdomen. The next type is the lumbar nerves. The lumbar spine is located in the lower back, below the cervical and thoracic section of the spine. It consists of 5 vertebrae known as L1 to L5. These nerves which control communication between the brain and the lungs. The last nerve would be the sacral nerves. The sacrum is the triangle-shaped bone at the end of the spine between the lumbar spine and the tailbone. The sacral spine consists of 5 segments, which is called S1 to S5. It affects the nerve communication to the lower portion of the body. The next slide would be the sectional organization of the spinal cord. There is an illustration here that consists of 18 parts of the spinal cord. The first one is the posterior white column. The second one is the posterior gray horn. The third one is the lateral gray horn. Next is lateral white column. Next is anterior gray horn. Next is anterior white column. Next is anterior median fissure. Next is anterior white commissure. Next is anterior gray commissure. Next part is the ventral root. Next is somatic. Next part is the motor nuclei visceral. Next part is the visceral. Next is the sensory nuclei somatic. Next is the dorsal root ganglion. The upper is the dorsal root. Next is the posterior gray commissure. You can see it in the middle. And the last one would be the posterior median sulcus. That's the parts of sectional organization of the spinal cord. The next presenter is Miss Crystal Ginkle.
Thank you, Miss Anne. The next topic that I will be discussing is about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the group of neurons or the ganglia and bundles of axons or nerves that are outside of the brain and spinal cord. Ganglia are of two types. The ganglia contain unipolar sensory neurons and autonomic ganglia. The ganglia contain unipolar sensory neurons are found on the dorsal root of all spinal nerves as well as associated with many of the cranial nerves, while the autonomic ganglia are in the sympathetic chain. The associated paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia or interminal ganglia near or within the organs controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Nerves are classified as cranial nerves or spinal nerves on the basis of their connection to the brain or spinal cord, respectively. The 12 cranial nerves can be strictly sensory in function, strictly motor in function, or a combination of the two functions. Sensory fibers are axons of sensory ganglia that carry sensory information into the brain and target sensory nuclei. Motor fibers are axons of motor neurons in motor nuclei of the brain stem and target skeletal. Spinal nerves are all mixed nerves with both sensory and motor fibers. Spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord and reorganize through plexuses, which then gives rise to systemic nerves. Thoracic spinal nerves are not part of any plexus but give rise to the intercostal nerves directly. The next topic will be discussed by Miss Julianne Orbista.
Thanks, ma'am. There are 31 spinal nerves, named for the level of the spinal cord at which each one emerges. They are 8 pair of cervical nerves, designated C1 to C8, 12 thoracic nerves, designated T1 to T12, 5 pair of lumbar nerves, designated S1 to S5, 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord and reorganize through plexuses, which then give rise to systematic nerves. Thoracic spinal nerves are not part of any plexus but give rise to intercostal nerves directly. Next reporter is Ma'am Windy.
My report is all about somatic nervous system. Somatic nervous system is responsible for our conscious perception of the environment and for our voluntary responses to that perception by means of skeletal muscles. Peripheral sensory neurons receive input from environmental stimuli, but the neurons that produce motor responses originate in the central nervous system. It is associated with voluntary responses, though many can happen without conscious awareness, like breathing. Division of anatomic nervous system. Sympathetic system is associated with the fight or flight response, responds to the threat and produces a readiness to confront the threat or to run away. Parasympathetic activity is referred to by the epithet of rest and digest. When the external environment does not represent any immediate danger, a restful mode descends on the body and the digestive system is more active. Homeostasis is the balance between the two systems at each target effectors. Dual innervation determines activity. For example, the heart that receives connections from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. One causes heart rate to increase, whereas the other causes heart rate to decrease. That's the end of our video and reporting. I would like to thank you for the group of graduating for the cooperation and help of everyone. Thank you.
The great and mighty nervous system, or the brain as most of us call it. What makes this organ unique is that within it lies the ability for humans to know oneself. This feature distinguishes and sets the human species apart from the rest of creation. This ability is known as consciousness or intelligence. To begin, let's look at the primary function of the nervous system. The basic purpose is to coordinate all of the activities of the body. It enables the body to respond and adapt to changes that occur both inside and outside the body. Now, the nervous system is actually split into two parts: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We'll explore the peripheral later, but first, let's look at the central nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of two major structures: the brain and the spinal cord. As most people know, the brain is found within the cranium or skull, and there are 6 main sections among other structures within it. These 6 sections are the cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The first section is the cerebrum. This is the largest section. It's divided into 2 major hemispheres, which are the right and left hemisphere. And the cerebrum is further divided into 4 lobes. These 4 lobes are the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. The frontal lobe is primarily responsible for reasoning and thought. The parietal is primarily responsible for integrating sensory information. The temporal is primarily responsible for processing auditory information from the ears. And the occipital is primarily responsible for processing visual information from the eyes. The second section of the brain is the cerebellum. This is the section located in the back of the head, below the cerebrum, and above the first cervical of the neck. It is responsible for muscle coordination, balance, posture, and muscle tone. The diencephalon section is found between the cerebrum and the midbrain. It contains 2 structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus behaves much like a relay station and directs sensory impulses to the cerebrum. And the hypothalamus controls and regulates autonomic nervous system functions such as temperature, appetite, water balance, sleep, and blood vessel constriction and dilation. The hypothalamus also plays a role in the emotions such as anger, fear, pleasure, pain, and affection. The midbrain section is located below the cerebrum at the top of the brainstem. It is responsible for certain eye and auditory reflexes. The pons is located below the midbrain and in the brainstem. It is responsible for certain reflex actions such as chewing, tasting, and saliva production. And the last section is the medulla oblongata. It's the lowest part of the brainstem, and it connects with the spinal cord and is responsible for regulating heart and blood vessel function, digestion, respiration, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, and blood pressure. It's also known as the center for respiration. Now that we've covered the brain, let's take a look at the other half of the central nervous system, the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the link between the brain and the nerves and the rest of the body. The spinal cord is divided into 4 different regions: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and the afferent and efferent spinal nerves, which merge to form the peripheral nerves. The afferent spinal nerves are responsible for carrying information from the body to the brain. And the efferent spinal nerves are responsible for carrying information from the brain to the body. Now, within this elaborate system of nerves, neurons, and dendrites, there is a system that regulates the functions of the central nervous system, which lie outside its major components such as the brain and the spinal cord. This system is known as the peripheral nervous system and is subdivided into 2 smaller systems: the somatic system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is responsible for carrying motor and sensory information both to and from the central nervous system. This system is made up of nerves that connect to the skin, sensory organs, and all skeletal muscles. The somatic system is also responsible for nearly all voluntary muscle movements, as well as for processing sensory information that arrives via external stimuli including hearing, touch, and sight. The structures that allow this communication to happen between the nerves throughout the body and the central nervous system are known as the afferent sensory neurons and the efferent motor neurons. Now, afferent simply means conducting inward, and efferent means conducting outward. So just like in the spinal nerves, the afferent neurons take information from the nerves to the central nervous system, and the efferent neurons take information from the central nervous system to the muscle fibers throughout the body. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is vital to our survival. Have you ever heard of the fight or flight response to danger? The sympathetic nervous system revs up the body when confronted with imminent danger to either defend yourself or to escape the threat. The parasympathetic nervous system is the counterbalance to the sympathetic response to danger, whether real or imagined. Once the threat is gone, the parasympathetic brings all the systems of the body back to normal. Now at this point, you should have a basic understanding of the nervous system, but let's do a quick recap. The basic purpose of the nervous system is to coordinate all the activities of the body. It enables the body to respond and adapt to changes that occur both inside and outside the body. The 2 major parts to the nervous system are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is also divided into 2 major structures, the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is found within the skull or cranium, and it is made up of 6 main sections. These 6 sections are the cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The other half of the central nervous system is the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is the link between the brain and the nerves and the rest of your body. The spinal cord is divided into 4 different regions: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and afferent and efferent spinal nerves, which merge to form the peripheral nerves. Now that we know the brain and spinal cord primarily make up the central nervous system, let's look at the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is essentially the nervous system outside of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is then subdivided into 2 smaller systems called the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So, as you can see, the nervous system is quite complex, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Thanks for watching.